Hi, homeschoolers. Welcome back to another Homeschool Reading Time. Thank you for tuning in. Today we have another book, kind of Halloween related. Pick a pumpkin, Mrs. Miley. All right, let's get into the book. Millie. Let's call her Mrs. Millie, not Miley. Millie. All right. Pick a pumpkin, Mrs. Millie. Yeah, there we go. She's a teacher, just like me. Pick a Pumpkin, Mrs. Millie by Judy Cox. Illustrated by Joe Matthew. Mrs. Millie, our teacher, is really silly. Ooh. Good morning, class, she says. It's nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Ooh. It's nice to see you too, Mrs. Millie, we say. Today, we are going to the pumpkin pets. Pumpkin pets? Mrs. Millie tells us, "Ah, don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean the pumpkin patch. We'll pick pumpkins for our harvest party and bring them yak to school." "No!" we shout. "You mean back to school, not yak to school." We line up to get on the bus. "It's cold today," Mrs. Millie says. "Don't forget your jackals." "Don't you mean our jackets?" we asked, giggling. Hee. Look, they're putting on their jackals. They look warm, right? Do you want a jacket or a jackal? Which one? At the farm, Farmer Don greets us at the gate. Greet means to say hello. Greeting, he's greeting them. "We'll go on a hayride," says Mrs. Millie. "Everybody on the dragon." "Oh, don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean the wagon, not the dragon." But I want to ride on a dragon. That looks more fun than the wagon. The hayride takes us down the road. "Look," calls Mrs. Millie, "a harecrow." "We know what you mean, a scarecrow," we tell her. We climb off the wagon and run into the field. "Be sure to pick the pig one," called Mrs. Millie. "Ooh, a pig pumpkin? Mrs. Millie, you mean the big one." Yeah, there's not a pig pumpkin, it's a big pumpkin. We wade through the muddy fields. Look, it's very muddy. "Look for round orange pumas," called Mrs. Millie. "Pumpkins," we shout. Not pumas. They're not pumas, they're pumpkins. She's very silly, right? After everyone has found a pumpkin, we load them onto the wagon. "Now we will visit the barn," says Mrs. Millie. "You can be the animals." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean see the animals." Look, they're all telling her we're not going to be the animals, we're going to see the animals. Oh, these two words, they rhyme. Be, see. Oh, they're very close. So you have to listen to what she says. She does not say, "You can see the animals." You have to listen closely because they rhyme. Be, see, me, three. Those all rhyme. "You can be the animals?" No. Oh, what's this rhyme? This animal is a goat, but she said, yeah, you'll see in just a second. We feed the horses. We toss grain. Tossing means to throw like this. Grain to the chickens. Mrs. Millie takes a picture of the pigs. Time to pet the boats, she says, smiling. Silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean the goats. Mrs. Millie pets the billy. The billy? Yeah, it's called a billy goat. Let's help Farmer Don snake the leaves, says Mrs. Millie. You're so silly, we cry. You mean rake the leaves. We jump into a leaf pile. I spy a corn maze, says Mrs. Millie. Who wants to play hide and sheep? Hide and seek, Mrs. Millie, we yell. Look, do you want to play hide and seek or hide and sheep? This one's on a ladder. This one has binoculars. Wow, they're so cute. Ooh, a spider. Ready for some hot apple cider? Asked Mrs. Millie. You mean apple cider, we say. How can you be so silly? Finally, it's time to leave. We'll take our pumpkins back to Mule, says Mrs. Millie. We know what you mean, back to school, we shout. We can carve them into gecko-lanterns, says Mrs. Millie. You mean jack-o'-lanterns, we tell her. Aw, they're all laughing. It's not back to Mule, it's back to the school. Wasn't the pumpkin patch fun? Mrs. Millie says as we line up for the bus. Oh, wait, let's listen to that one more time. What does she say? Wasn't the pumpkin patch fun? Huh, that's not fun. She's not saying fun. She's saying fawn, a baby deer. What? Mrs. Millie? You're so silly. Mrs. Millie says as we line up for the bus. Yes, Mrs. Millie, we had fun, we shout. Farmer Don loads our pumpkins onto the bus. Thank you, we tell him. As the bus pulls away, we wave goodbye to Farmer Don and his billy boats. Bye, Farmer Don. Bye, billy boats. All right. Now I have 3 questions for you. Number 1, how was Mrs. Millie silly? What did she do to be silly? How was she silly? And number 2, what were 2 things she changed into something else by saying a rhyme? So can you remember 2 words that she changed? Maybe like fun to fawn. But you have to think of 2 more, okay? Fun, fawn, that's 1, but you have to think of 2 more words that she changed. And number 3, what could you rhyme with shoe? What word sounds like shoe that you can rhyme with shoe? All right, thank you so much for listening, and come back for another Hope School reading time. Bye-bye.